Let's start with prayer, because I certainly need it. Father, we know that only as your Spirit works in our hearts and minds can anything of real significance happen, and so we ask for that Spirit now. And Lord, we ask that what comes from you may be written on our hearts and there burn away until we are obedient, because we know that obedience to you is the best life we can have. So be with us now, we pray, for Christ's sake. Amen. I've spent my life in the educational world. I never left an institution of higher learning once I got inside one, except for one full year away, still paid by said institution, but I was in the middle of Africa. I had a very privileged life in that sense. Even more privileged in that I began from a blue-collar background. And actually, to start blue-collar and end up where I did is a long journey, but it's a great privilege to make that journey. I always loved learning. I didn't think anything about it. Nobody told me about homework. I never did homework until I went to the equivalent of high school. God had given me a mind that remembered things. And of course, I don't think we make enough use of the fact that your children, especially when they're very small, can outdo you on anything that involves memorization. And the medievals, when they invented what led to the universities, made use of that fact. And now we're trashing it, of course. Now, those of you who still have a memory of university, did you ever come home from a day in university thinking you were wiser than you were at the beginning of the day? Usually students start laughing when you say that. Wiser? The word wisdom never appeared. And that's quite right. You memorized and dumped, didn't you? And you couldn't pass a single exam that you passed at the university some years ago. Whereas Socrates would find that appalling, because he says, I'm older and wiser. I would do better now. That concept is totally foreign to university. But the medievals, being more deeply Christian than we are, asked the question, how has God made us for the purpose of learning? And they realized that step one is that he brings children into the world with memories like steel traps. I don't think 4-year-olds have lost anything that they heard. It's all there. The right stimulus, it will come out. After all, they learn a language with no formal training. And I have 22 grandchildren at this stage. And one of my great pleasures is to be there when they make their first philosophical comment, or to hear of it. My favorite one is very short, not fair. Now, the little guy hasn't even got complete sentences yet, but he has a concept of justice. I mean, a professor of philosophy could write a book with the title Not Fair as a starting point. There it is, in place, in a child who doesn't yet have sentences. God put it there. And he gave them memories like steel traps, especially for stories. You know that if you read a story to your children and it becomes a favorite story, and you have to read it again and again and again. Now, even in our house, the little ones have their own bookshelf. And if they're wise, they take their favorite books to my wife, Sally, because she is endlessly patient and will read to them for hours. If they bring it to me, I get bored very quickly. So I try and shorten their story. Yeah, I can see some of you, but not all of you, read to children. As one of them said not long ago, "Grandad, have you forgotten how to read?" They have brought me a book they know every word of. So why do they want it repeated? And this is true of every culture I've visited, and I've visited many. It's what's wrong with multiculturalism, because the story that your children inhabit is going to determine a great deal about their future, the way they think, the way they function. So, before horrible things like television were invented, in the Western world you grew up with the Bible. Before that, of course, the Jews grew up with the Old Testament. Now, if you grow up with the Old Testament as your main book early in life, the book that you remember, you get a Jew with Jewish ethics, and you get a highly developed sense of justice. Our ideas of justice come from the Jews. If you add to it the New Testament stories, you now add to that justice. You don't take away from it. I did not come to do away with the law, but to fulfill it. It's still operative because we're all breaking the Ten Commandments to this day. But added to it now is the dimension of compassion. There were no hospitals that we would recognize as hospitals till Jesus came. But within 100 years of Jesus coming, hospitals started to emerge. And they were monasteries, of course. They had no treatment. I mean, doctors didn't have any treatment until roughly 1866. That's an amazing number, isn't it? But there was no effective treatment before that. That was when Lister, for the first time, set a compound fracture which was uniformly fatal using antisepsis, and the boy survived for the first time. History matters. So if you grow up with in the pagan world, you grow up with the book of nature, and you end up as a fatalist and a con man. Do you get those emails from Nigeria? I know that you are a good evangelical man, and my evangelical husband died recently, leaving more money than I can handle. I've heard that you would handle it well. Please send me your bank account number and I will forward you the money. I mean, and people buy it, you know. I've been to Nigeria many times. I like going there. And they tell me, well, about 1 in 60,000 Americans will fall for it. And that's enough. We can live on that for a year. Because their bank account, of course, will be empty in the morning. A con man is a hero in Nigeria. Different story, different culture. Some things possible, others impossible. They're much more biblically literate than we are. I remember on one occasion in Nigeria, having visited almost every medical school in the country, and I was being driven in the car of a Nigerian doctor by a friend of his, and I discovered some time ago that on the journey that A, he didn't have any money, so I was paying all the bills, and I was about to learn, amazingly, because I should have learned much earlier, but for some reason we hadn't been stopped at a security spot. And on the way back to the airport for me to fly home, the last day there, we were stopped. And they came and they did the usual African thing of asking for his documents, and I discovered that his documents were not in order. So they pulled him out of the car. Now I also knew he had no money, and the only reason for stopping us was to get money. They were not the least bit interested in the law, except as a means of getting money. So I knew they would come to my window, which they shortly did. And I was in something of a fey mood, and I took them on. I laid it on with a shovel, basically, that I had just spent 10 days in their medical schools, helping to improve the level of education that their future doctors were getting. And now I was on my way back to the airport, and they were going to cause me to miss my flight. What kind of image of Nigeria was I taking back with me, etc., etc. And after a few minutes, they gave in and let me go. I won round one. But I knew, now I had started something. They have CB radios. We would be stopped again. And sure enough, 20 miles later on, we were stopped once more. This time, the guy in charge of the stopping point with his brass buttons turned up at my window. And they had discovered, of course, that I was a Christian. And he was a smart guy. He said, do you have any knowledge of Matthew 5? I said, I have a passing knowledge of that chapter. I could recite the whole chapter, but I didn't tell him that. And he said, it says there that if your enemy takes you to court, you should settle with him on the way. I said, yes, it does. You're quite right. Have you ever noticed what Jesus says a little later on? He said, no. He says, what should a man give in exchange for his soul? You are about to exchange your soul for a measly bribe. Is that a good idea? He said, you better go. And we weren't stopped again. And he will dine out on the story because they love those stories. If you win, even though he's got a Kalashnikov and you've got nothing, in Nigerian culture, you're quite safe. If you won that battle, everybody says, you won. Wonderful. Put the guns down for a bit. Different culture. Now, the medievals started with the Bible, and they started with the knowledge that children had good memories, so they filled those memories with Scripture. And they, to this day, of course, in Africa, they have superb memories. And they can get through our universities without getting an education because they can do it on memory, and that's all you require for our universities in undergraduate at least. Terrible state to get to. It's good in other ways. I remember the first time I ever preached in my favorite village in the Itumbi Mountains in what was then Zaire. I knew it was a special village the moment I walked in, and the pastor was an ex-drunken carpenter, but the carpentry bit had rubbed off and he was now a Christian, and he asked me to preach. And a year later I was back and he asked me to preach again. And before I started my sermon that Sunday morning, he reminded the congregation very accurately of the whole of my sermon the year before. I said to him afterwards, "That was incredible." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you remember the whole thing." He said, "Well, don't they remember it in Canada?" I said, "They've forgotten by the time they get to the door." And he wouldn't believe me. He said, we'd never had a sermon like that before, so we sat down and we talked about it till we all agreed what it was. So it's our sermon as well now. Astonishing phenomenon. That's living in the Word. That's wisdom. That's where wisdom comes from. So the trivium, you start with grammar. You start with the stories. Then you move on. You don't tell your children what the stories mean. Just read the stories. Sunday school should be entirely teaching the children the stories of the Bible. No, don't moralize. It's boring. It's not the way it works. The stories are what they love. So make sure they know all the stories. And then you wait for the question of why or how. And then you teach them logic. We don't teach classical logic at all now. I could trap you in logical errors if you're an average audience quite easily. Professors routinely make logical errors. The course we teach at Augustine, none of our students will do that when they leave us because they've been taught classical logic. You only get mathematical logic at the university these days because classical logic might destroy their libertarian worldview. But one of our students went off 2 or 3 years back now to pre-med at McMaster, source of many troubles in America with problem-based learning and all that nonsense. He stopped a professor on the first PowerPoint of medical school. The first lecture in that pre-med program was on biopsychosocial medicine. So click, up comes the title. Click. There are no absolutes in biopsychosocial medicine. Nathan's hand went up immediately. And I assure you, questions from the floor in year 1 of university are very, very rare. But after the first PowerPoint, I've never heard of this before. And the guy said, "Young man, do you have a problem?" He said, "Yes, sir. Is that sentence internally consistent?" Now, many of them, like you, were silent. Some of them, like you, were smiling. A few were laughing. And the prof turned out to be a good guy. He realized he was caught. And the only thing to do when a student is upstaged you is to climb down gracefully, which he did fairly well with a lame excuse. He said, I accept that. I must have been asleep when I wrote that. I will change it. Of course, half the class didn't know what was going on. But it led to change. See, you cannot make an absolute statement to prove that absolute statements don't exist. That is the death of the law of non-contradiction, and without the law of non-contradiction, we have no learning whatsoever. It's all a myth. It's all nonsense. Cannot be that way. So, grammar, logic, and only then rhetoric. At the end, you start teaching them how to engage an audience, how to get their attention, what to do when you lose their attention, etc., etc. Now, your erstwhile president, Obama, was brilliant at rhetoric, but no content. And his commitments were all in the wrong place. I remember hearing him when he was a senator, and I thought, he's good at this. I'm good at rhetoric. I can, been there, done that. I've got out of tight corners in slightly shady ways on occasions. But he made a habit of it, and he knew he could get away with it. And from that day onwards, I never listened to him again, but I would read what he said. His book is full of contradictions. I remember on the second inaugural, reading the Washington Post, I think it was, and the the writer said, "You will be surprised to hear that I did not listen to our president yesterday, but I read every word of what he said. There is no content there." It was my diagnosis too. Rhetoric is important. Jesus was brilliant at it. Paul was brilliant at it. We're meant to engage. Good talks are meant to hold your attention. If you stop listening to me, I'll stop talking. You're all listening at the moment. That's fine. That's as it should be. In fact, a really good talk is one of the most wonderful things you can ever have. I can remember sermons from when I was a student, because I had a horrible choice every Sunday. I could go and listen to Martin Lloyd-Jones or John Stott. It set my standards rather high after that, so I've never been content since. But they only got to my head, not my heart. That was going to take another 20 years. And they never talked about the things we're going to talk about in a moment. So we live in a world, the university world in which I lived, is information rich, knowledge poor, and wisdom absent. Information is a medical student. Knowledge is a resident. And wisdom is what you need when you're dying. And it won't be available if the liberal elite have their way. Because knowledge, information without knowledge is useless. It can't connect. Knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. That's why residents are dangerous. They get on doing things they shouldn't do. And the older guy's job is to hold them in check, because they know what life is about. Now, how did we get to this state? We always like quick solutions. You are particularly addicted to easy solutions in America. The trouble is they don't work. And I'm glad that it wasn't me that said that. It was, I've got a name block for him at the moment, but he was a journalist of Mencken said it. Americans are addicted to simple solutions. The problem is they don't work. And in particular, you are largely ahistorical. That again is not your fault. And that's what I had to learn over the way. Others understood it as well about your nation. Two of the people who visited you understood this immediately. I think the best book on why America succeeded is de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. Here you have a French aristocrat who lost many of his family in the bloody French Revolution and came here to see why your revolution had succeeded. And he said, "I did not understand America till I went into the churches of America." Chesterton, 100 years later, put it as only Chesterton would. America is a country with the soul of a church. Sadly, the soul is dying. The church is not what it was, is it? You have fewer friends than your parents had, reliable friends. And the liberal elite who are ruling you, who you rightly threw out. Trump was a genius in the sense that he put his finger on something very important. A French intellectual that I've been reading recently has taken me a step further on what Trump needs to understand that he intuitively understood. But I come from a blue-collar background, and I have watched them being destroyed in Britain. All my uncles and my grandfather were toolmakers. My grandfather was a Rolls-Royce toolmaker. That's the best you could be. A 10,000th of an inch man. That's nothing in modern engineering, but it was a lot. That's the human limit, and that's hard to achieve. But they were proud men. The British class system kept you down. It was hard to get out of the working class. But all the working class men that I grew up with had skills. So everything that was needed domestically around the house, there was somebody who could fit it, could do it. And in our community, and it was a community, money didn't change hands because what went around came around. Whoever needed the job doing bought the materials, provided the tea or the beer or whatever, and the job was done. Everybody contributed. We didn't lock our doors. British equivalent of Detroit. I grew up there during and after the Second World War. We did not lock our doors. Because although the working class had ceased going to church for almost 50 years at that stage, they still had the history there of how you ought to be. Because the Brits, unlike North Americans, did not take the Bible out of church, out of school. Because they said, without the Bible, you cannot read your own language. You cannot understand it. Now, every decent English program has to have a course on the Bible as literature, because you don't understand your own language. Let me illustrate, because it will write it into your soul, certainly those of you who've ever gone to war. The last telegram sent from Dunkirk to London at the beginning of the Second World War, as the British were being pushed into the sea by the Germans, was just 3 words. It arrived in London and was immediately understood. It wasn't coded, and the Germans clearly didn't understand it. The words were, but if not. Raise your hand if you know what it means. 1 at the back, 2, 3, 4. That's good, that's much better than, and you've heard it before, so it doesn't count. You do know it. It goes like this. Be it known unto you, King Nebuchadnezzar, our God is able to save us from the fiery furnace, but if not, we will not bend the knee. What a magnificent telegram to send. But how much more magnificent, immediately understood. Because all the people on the receiving end, like me, went to school where every day there was a chapter of the Bible read in school. In fact, we had in my primary school, elementary school, every class had to learn a psalm by heart and be able to speak it chorally as a class. And then one morning, each class went up on the stage and recited their psalm. I can still remember Miss Crockett teaching us what it means to go up to the hill of the Lord. That was school. It was school. So we were deeply embedded in the scriptures. And we can only speak to one another by metaphors. Now, God uses amazing people to set things like Augustine College going. The next piece in this puzzle was an interesting one. One of the most radical homosexuals in North America was the agent this time. Also, one of the best teachers of Aristotle and Socrates. He died of AIDS. He preyed on his students with an E, not an A. His name was Alan Bloom. The Closing of the American Mind. Any of you had that book in your hands? I hope you didn't read it all. It's not worth reading all of it, but the first chapter is well worth reading. He wrote the book because the American high school system was delivering students to him that he could not teach. They needed, in his view, remedial training. And at the end of the first chapter, there is a beautiful paragraph in which Alan Bloom reminisces about his family history. His grandparents arrived from Europe with nothing. They worked in the sweatshops. Of course, his parents' generation owned sweatshops. Typical Jewish march upwards. And his generation, all MDs and PhDs. But he says, my grandparents were humble folk. They never went inside an institution of higher learning. But everything done in their home was spiritually rich. They found reasons for the performance of their duties and the bearing of their sorrows by reference to the book, the Old Testament. And they could go to the synagogue where they heard great scholars who spoke not from an alien perspective, but from the same perspective, while simply going deeper and providing guidance. That, says Bloom, is what a community is. Something that invites high and low into a common story of meaning. We no longer have a common story of meaning in the Western world. That's our problem. And what we're talking about tonight is how you recreate a common story of meaning for pre-university education. It's necessary. But what got to me was the next paragraph. When I look at my cousins, all of whom have been educated in the American way, all of whom are MDs or PhDs, the classic American success story, they have no wisdom comparable to that of my grandparents. When they speak about the meaning of life and death, the relationship between husbands and wives, parents and children, it's a bunch of cliches. I thought it can't be that bad. Now, his basic thesis, he wanted every student who came to him to know the Bible. An atheist. Why did he want that? Because he can't teach without the metaphors. The problem with the black community at the moment wanting their black version of English is that it's not rich enough to learn from. You've got to take the most powerful language available to you and use it. As good black scholars like Thomas Sowell will point out to you. Listen to Thomas Sowell on YouTube if you never have. He'll show you how to talk about these things. They hate him for it, but he's right. He said he's so glad he had a teacher who said, look, you've got a good mind, but you'll go nowhere until you use the language properly. And she made him do it. Grammar matters. Speaking properly matters. Reading good literature matters. And it's father's job to see that the children do it. The dining room table is where it primarily takes place in our world now. And get rid of the television. It's not necessary. You can watch what rubbish you want on a computer if you need to, but don't pollute your children's minds. In particular, their story, the American story now, is not the biblical story. We're much worse off than that. We're not even at the pagan level. What's the repeated story in your lives, those of you who are younger than me, and that's most of you? I never saw a television growing up because we didn't have one. What a gift that was. Neither did my children. Can you imagine that? The result was that they read 10 times as many books as their peer group. They were way ahead. You don't learn anything from television. The language is debased because television is there to bring minds to advertisers, that's all. And they don't want the language to get in the way. But you all remember the jingles, don't you? I remember the first time I said this in Texas, there was a very lady like this lady here who gets things done. And I said that if you tested your 8-year-olds in Sunday school, they would fail a test of basic biblical literacy but score very high on a test of advertising in the last 5 years. She did the test and she said, you're right, they got 100% on the advertising and pitiable levels on the Bible stories. Those ads are in your mind. They don't do it because it doesn't work, they do it because it does work. I tease my wife endlessly about the things she buys every now and again. I said, you watch television again? You know, it's ridiculous. They get to you. That's who we've become. Now, what virtues do television ads provide for your children? None. They are not morally consequential. In fact, they teach that you can do anything and get away with it. In fact, the bottom line for the American youth is just do it. Nike. And they're just doing it, and we wonder why we're in trouble. Because God's way of setting up a society is just don't do it. Rewrite the 10 Commandments as the 10 divine intolerances, and you're well on your way to a better way of looking at the world. You can do it easily. God sets up the framework for flourishing in terms of a legitimate intolerance. I love doing this, you know, especially because you can imagine if I'm lecturing in a liberal environment, at the end of the lecture, which has to be a little bit more guarded than this one, the communist response, and I'm expecting it is some woman usually, to say, I am offended by what you've just said. I find it intolerant. And I will say, I'm very sorry you're offended. That was not my intent. Now can we discuss whether or not what I said was true? And she loses that argument every time, of course. Because she says, there's no such thing as truth. I said, how do you know that? If there's no truth, you can't know that. You're self-contradictory at the first fence. You're out of the race. Get real. Tolerance is not even a virtue. Tolerance is a means of control in our world. That's what, when they say I'm intolerant or I am offended, they don't want me to apologize at the level of saying, I think I can show you ought not to be offended. They want me to abjectly request forgiveness, and I'm not going to do that. And our students won't either. So what happened? The medievals got it right. The story was rich, and yet we went nowhere in terms of science. Greek science was not science. They did mathematics. Physics? I mean, Aristotle's physics had to be got rid of, and it took 1,500 years to do it. I mean, trusted his own brilliant mind so much that he never bothered to find out whether he was right when he said, obviously heavy things fall faster than light ones. Look at a feather and a stone. And he didn't take it any further. He got the mind he could have done. Should have gone to the nearest cliff, and he would have found out that, yes, for feathers, that's true, but put the feather next to a penny and it falls with the penny. No, the physics was wrong. The maths was right. And his way of thinking was deductive. And it's too difficult for us to do science in that way. So what happened next was very interesting. Bloom had shown me that the Bible was essential to being able to talk. But what had happened to me? I was 20 years in the wilderness. I listened to Martin Lloyd-Jones and John Stott, and each day at medical school, they were winning the battle, and I didn't even know what it was. And they didn't even know what they were doing to me. That's how subtle the devil is. Within weeks of arriving in medical school, I had become a reductionist. Nobody had used the word, and I didn't know what it meant, even if I'd been told what it was. And even in church, you see reductionism at work. I look upon it as a basic problem in our society. Certainly it was one of the starting points of the college. Reductionism has a long history, and it's an interesting one. When Greek learning came back into Europe over the Pyrenees from the Muslims who had guarded it, I mean, a long journey it took from the schism in the church, so the Latin West and the Greek-speaking East were separate, and soon they couldn't speak each other's languages to any significant degree. But that learning went all the way around the southern edge of the Mediterranean, came back into Spain, and then he came over into Europe. But by this time, the soul of Europe had been purified to a considerable degree. The collapse of Roman antiquity led to the rise of the monasteries. That was the only place where learning was kept alive. They were not the Dark Ages altogether. If you went into a garden at the end of at the height of the Roman power, you would have found in the garden a pornographic statue. By the 13th century, at the time of St. Francis, the only gardens were in monasteries, and you would find a Madonna or a cross. And slavery had disappeared. Not feudalism, but slavery as such had disappeared from Europe without any law being passed. The soul of Europe had been purified. If you don't like dates, read G.K. Chesterton's little book on St. Francis. It's the only history book I know without a single date in it. He assumes you know that you're in the 13th century. But that's what happened. But the new learning took off. And in the hands of Thomas Aquinas in particular, and his amazing synthesis of Christian theology and Greek philosophy, which was an amazing intellectual feat, the world changed. Now, for evangelicals, you probably don't know this, and you probably should. At the end of his life, a few months before he died, Thomas saw a vision of Christ in the chapel. He never talked about it, but another monk was there at the time. He didn't see what Thomas saw, but he heard a conversation. Very brief. Jesus said to Thomas, "It is well done, Thomas. What do you wish?" And Thomas replied, "Only you, O Lord." And he never wrote another word after that. When asked why he never finished the Summa, he said, "It's just straw." The greatest intellectual feat in 5 centuries, just straw, compared to one sentence with Christ. The Catholics don't talk about that very much. They need to talk about it more. But, like you, many of you worry about your children going off to university, and you have good reason to fear. I have colleagues who take malicious pleasure in destroying simple evangelical faith. Going to Bible school, by the way, makes it worse, because you come quoting scripture rather naively, and that makes you very easy for an academic to play games with. I quote scripture in the university now, but I do 2 things which you need to learn to do. I never do the televangelist chapter and verse thing. That's stupid. And I paraphrase. so that they can't use Google. It's essential that Google will be useless. They recognize that what I've said is too smart to be me, the best ones who are real scholars. And I say, I see some of you realize that was a quotation. And they nod. I say, well, who do you think wrote it? And they usually say Socrates. And I usually say, well, it was a smart man, but not that one. And I don't tell them who it was. They have to think about it and take it at face value. They'll find out in due course, but I'm long gone. Too late for them to complain. You've got to, and paraphrasing is good. Memorization is for children. Your test is, could you talk me through the major passages of the New Testament without opening the book? Could you give me a thumbnail sketch of what I will find in each of the books of the Bible and why they're there? That's your test as an adult. For instance, I could talk you through the whole of the Sermon on the Mount now without any need of the text, because I've learnt it at that level. The first thing I do with my students at Augustine is teach them the value of a précis. Do any of you write précis? No. Probably most of you don't know what I'm talking about, right? Well, I'll tell you. So, précis is the French word for precise, with accent grave on the first E and no E at the end. But it's a technique. And you can try it out for yourself. If you the next passage of Scripture that you come across and you say, I've read this so many times, but I don't know what it's about. And you read it again and you still don't know what it's about. Write a précis of it. So I say to the students, this year for instance, you've all read Ephesians 1 and 2 many times. Any of you plead not guilty to that? You've all read Ephesians 1 and 2 many times, right? Could any of you tell me the argument? No. Write a précis and you'll never forget the argument again. What you do when you write a précis is rather like, analogously, if you want to understand a building and redo it like Ty does, you pull everything out except the main supporting structures, don't you? Till you can see how the building works. And then you can put it back together again. Well, you can do the same with literature. Pull it apart to find out what makes it work, to get at Paul's basic argument. And then you can see what are the frills and what are not. So in practical terms, you remove every adverb and every adjective because they're never essential to an argument. You make every complex sentence, and Paul's sentences are. I mean, some of them go half a page. You have to turn them all into simple sentences. You're writing something ugly, just like you're making a beautiful building ugly to see how it works, if it's got to be rejuvenated properly. And when you've finished, you will know the argument. So you can take the first 2 chapters of Ephesians and reduce them to about 14 lines of handwritten material, and you'll have the argument. You'll never forget it again. You know what's there. You know how to find it. It's yours. I even have got stopped on planes by ex-students for them to say thank you for teaching them to do this. I'll never forget one occasion because the last 10 years of teaching in the university, I taught I brought in a lot of money and I published papers, so I didn't have to do a lot of teaching, but I did have to teach one course in the science faculty. The rest of the department said I had to do at least that much. So I taught a 4th year honours biochemistry course. The first lecture was devoted to getting rid of most of the students, so I got them down to 20. And then we started seriously. And I had noticed, it'd been brought very vividly to my attention that the cheating in the university was horrendous. I was invigilating a Christmas exam and there was a bomb scare 10 minutes after the exam started. And that was suspicious, but you have to take bomb scares seriously. So I said to the students, put down your paper, pick up your bags and your coat, go for a walk, 20 minutes, and we'll come back. I went for a walk too. Got to the far end of the car park, there were a group of students. One said to the other, you idiot, you were supposed to memorize the 3rd question. It was obvious who planned the bomb scare. And then I thought, but all the students went out very orderly. Did they all know about this? Did my students know about it? How would I know? I wouldn't. So I spent the next few weeks thinking about how I was going to stop them cheating in my class. And the only thing I could do was make cheating of no value. So I developed a course in biochemistry which had no requirement for memorization at all. There were no memory recall questions on my exam. It did last 8 hours. They needed 8 hours to do it. But the first thing I would say to them, I would teach them, remind them a bit of biochemistry, and then say, now go and write me a précis of that paper. And I want it in 3 days so I can read it and mark it before next session. And these were honest students. They hadn't seen a mark below 85 in the last 2 years. Nobody got a mark over 50%. You can imagine what the atmosphere was like initially. I said, well, the first lesson is this class is no place for pride. When you don't know something, say so. You didn't know what a précis was, you gave me a summary, they are not the same thing. They'd spent a couple of hours on it too. I'd written my précis in about 30 minutes. I gave them out, they could see the difference. I taught them how to do it. They all learned how to do it. Now, when those that went on to do a doctorate, most doctorates in the science area are going to be built around about not more than a dozen papers that really matter to the thesis. And most graduate students will spend 3 or 4 years constantly rereading those key papers. And I tell them, no, write a précis of each of them. Then you will find the faults in the ones that are there, and the faults that are there, and you'll know what they are, where the weak points are. And you will know them. You don't need it. Well, flying across the Atlantic a few years ago, a woman walked down the aisle. I was sitting in the aisle seat. She looked at me, walked on, but she hesitated. A few minutes later, she came back and she stopped. She said, "You're Professor Patrick, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, I plead guilty." And she said, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "I'm sorry, no." She said, "I took your class about 20 years ago. I'm a professor myself now, and I use your methods. Your way of approaching the literature saved me a year in my thesis. Thank you." And that's what it can do. And when we're rigorous, we do the same for our children. And it shows. All my children have come and said the way we were taught to think at the dining room table has been the most important thing in their lives. My son, I left the university and arrived as a professor in the Department of Mathematics. And look at my grandchildren, there's at least 4 professors on the way. You know, you can see them coming. We enjoy these kinds of questions. So that world that I lived in was good. My mother never went, like Bloom's grandparents, never went to university, never went inside a high institution of higher learning until she came to my graduation. That's the only reason I went and had for the ceremony. But she was wise. She taught Sunday school for 35 years on her own to a group of working class kids, about 30 to 50 children aged between 5 and 12 in one room. Never had any problems with discipline because she could sing, she could make them sing, and she was a brilliant storyteller. And she taught them all the stories of the Bible. It's all you need. What a gift, as I now realize. And she realized that she'd got an unusual, odd son, so she didn't make me learn verses, I learned chapters. Children, if a child can do that, let them realize it and how good it is to do that. But that did not prepare me for the modern university. And Stott and Lloyd-Jones didn't. I began within weeks to think about patients as diseases. I'd reduced the patient to a particular problem that I could handle. But that reductionism spread further and further and further. It shows up in church, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Where did it come from? Well, it comes way back from that Thomas Aquinas thing. Thomas had done something quite amazing. The universities started about the same time, and they were all teaching deductive Aristotelian logic. And the Bishop of Paris was worried about the humble poor. Would this new learning make them more or less Christian? Just like you worry about your children going to university. You with more reason to fear than the Bishop of Paris did. And so, temporarily, it turned out, deductive logic was banned. The Aristotelian logic was banned while it was looked at by the high authorities of the church to see whether it was suitable to be taught to undergraduates. Oxford took no notice, of course, so they charged on. Now, the next bit is pure artistic license on my part, but I think it's right. It would be rather like a professor being told in August that he could not use his notes from last year. He would not be a happy camper, would he? And that's what they were told. They were all under the authority of the bishop, but they had no option. So I imagine they all went to the pub and got drunk first, so to speak. When they recovered, they sobered up. They said, well, what are we going to do? And some bright guy said, well, we can't do deductive logic, but what about inductive logic? That's not banned. Aristotle knew about it, but never trusted it. So it wasn't a major part of the current teaching. Now, if you go to university and the way science is presented, they talk about the hypothetico-deductive system. That's because they don't want to admit that it's induction. It's not the hypothetico-deductive system, it's an inductive system. Now, induction is when you start from the particular to get to the big. Deduction is when you start from the big to get to the particular. Now, for centuries, the church had tried to get from God to everyday life and never made the journey. You got lost on the way. They were good at knowing when they got lost. They're brilliant, much more logical than we are. But they never completed the journey. I said, maybe we should do it the other way around. Now, here's something the missionaries don't know, particularly to Africa and South Asia, and they need to know. If you're a pagan, you cannot trust inductive logic. Can you see why? Obviously not. So I'll explain. Inductive logic depends upon the fact that under the surface chaos of life, you must trust that there is order. Because you trust that an experiment done in Blacksburg will give the same answer as one done in Ottawa. That's an act of faith. But that faith is justified if you believe that God is a God of order, but not if you don't. So if you believe in local evil spirits, inductive reasoning makes no sense at all. So that when we take our technology and techniques to Africa, they can use them, but they do not understand them, and they do not trust them in the way that we do. My expertise, I was privileged to work on severely malnourished children, to be part of the team that wrote the definitive protocols for their care, still not being done in mission hospitals 30 years after we did the work. I was bullied into going back to Africa in the 80s against my will because I knew that nobody had succeeded. There's never been a successful nutrition education program in sub-Saharan Africa for malnourished children. It doesn't work. The only clue was we can't even build a model of why it doesn't work. I went in the 80s, trained my children to do it. All my children spent 5 years, 5 summers resuscitating malnourished children. Children died in their arms, but didn't do them any harm, did them a lot of good. And I found out what the problem was. The nurses that I'd trained didn't believe what I'd trained them. So one of the nurses I'd trained had his own child die of malnutrition. And when I said to him what happened, he looked at the ground, not at me, telling me he was going to lie. And he said, we didn't feed him properly. I knew that wasn't what he believed. I didn't know what he did believe. I sent my supervisor. I want to know what he believes. He was back in a minute. He said, oh, he believed that an evil spirit took his child's appetite away. So he had spent his money on the witch doctor, and the child had died of malnutrition. But that is a rational thing to do if you believe in evil spirits. I was the one guilty of trivial thought, not him. And the witch doctor would say to me, at that level, he'd say, I can't touch you because your spirit is stronger. Still thinking in the same categories. But when we take our technology, we think that it's culturally neutral, but it's not. I could take you to at least 50 mills that have been given to villages in the area I know and love by Americans who see women pounding corn by hand for 8 hours a day. And next time they come, if they're very stupid, they bring a mill all the way from Africa. If they're sensible, they go to the nearest large town and buy one. And they give it to the village. Great rejoicing. It's not working within a year or two, because maintenance is a Christian concept. If a vehicle stops because of an evil spirit, what has oil got to do with it? And we wonder why it doesn't work. We'd do better teaching Deuteronomy 6. So, induction worked. It took a little while. It was Galileo who was the first one to do experiments in the modern sense, although Merton College and Paris in the centuries before him were on the way. It was a slow burn, but once it took off, it was vertical takeoff. Nothing like it had happened anywhere else in the world. So within 100 years of Newton, Laplace, a practicing Catholic, says to Napoleon, when asked where God fits in his science, he said, "Sire, I have no need of the hypothesis of God to do science." And he was right. Once you had the methodology, you don't need to acknowledge where it came from. In fact, you start playing word games to hide where it came from, which is what we're in the middle of now. But in the end, that will be a disaster. So I was very interested in science, and I was easily seduced into the idea that science could answer all the questions. It can't, as I now know very well. And for medicine, it's coming home to haunt us big time. Because more than 70% of the disease you see is to a degree self-induced, right? So the biggest problem coming into a doctor's office today is actually guilt. And the word doesn't yet occur in the index of the textbook. That's how bad our situation is. It's also why you can't have state-funded healthcare. It's dying everywhere. But that's another discussion, and I'm here to talk about truth as it relates to education. So the first thing that got to me was I became a reductionist. It shows up in the church, by the way, when you, Campus Crusade, bless them, when you give somebody a set of propositions and they tick them off and they sign at the bottom and you say they're a Christian, that's reductionism. Because you don't actually know, and I don't know, how Christ brought me into his kingdom. That's why we have so many theories. Always a giveaway that we don't actually know. And Jesus told us you don't know. When Nicodemus asked basically, how do I become like you? Jesus said, you can't get to where you want to go from where you are now. Until you are born of the Spirit, you cannot see, you cannot comprehend. God causes us to see, and we don't know how he does it. In most cases, when you become a Christian, no new information comes into your life, does it? Just a new way of being. And we don't know how he did it. The smarter you are, the more clear you are about it. Lewis, in Surprised by Joy, makes no attempt to explain how he came to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Because he didn't know. He knew that when he set out to go to Whipsnade Zoo, he wasn't sure about that. When he got back, he was. That's all he tells you, because that's all he knew. It's probably the thing of which we are most certain in our lives, that Christ has met us. But we don't know how he did it. And actually, that's the best witness you have in the modern university, to say to your colleagues, you can't even understand where I'm coming from, and I can't tell you how to do that, except that if you search, you will eventually find. Just this last year, I saw that come to a conclusion after a 25-year journey with one of my friends. When I first came to Ottawa, he's a journalist, a very good journalist. He came to a lecture that I gave, and as he left, he said to another journalist, I enjoyed that, didn't expect to. She happened to be the only Christian journalist I know in Ottawa. And she said, would you like to meet him? And he said, yes, as long as he doesn't know that. And she said, I can arrange that. And she did, and we became friends. We started having lunch together. He's an atheist, speaks 3 languages, PhD in history. And we argued about once every 2 or 3 months. And then a few years later, he wrote a piece in the Ottawa Citizen, which began like this: why taking the cross seriously can make you very cross. And he said, the Eastern Mediterranean at the time of Christ was not an ignorant backwater, but where Greek learning, Jewish theology, and Roman pragmatism met. Some fishermen, a tax collector, and a man who had a seizure on the road to Damascus persuaded their neighbors and then the whole Jewish empire that a dead Jewish carpenter was God. How weird is that? And this God didn't prance around exhibiting his power, but allowed his creatures to nail him to a stick on a dunghill, and that changed the history of the world. How weird is that? Even when the wild Norsemen met the wild Norsemen met the Irish monks won the argument, and the Norsemen laid off the slave girls and started to be good. And then he said, if I, as an atheist, wish to be honest, I have to acknowledge that people like Augustine and Aquinas, all the way down to C.S. Lewis, were not stupid. So if I'm going to be honest, I must read the scriptures, but I'm mortally afraid that if I do, the monk will win the argument. I immediately sent him an email saying, I wish I'd written that. And he said, you wrote 1 sentence, but you promised me you'd be available when I need you. I need to talk to you. I said, I thought you might, but the cook's away. You'll have to come to the pub tonight. No problem, he said, and turned up on his bike from his karate class. He's also a black belt. And he said, well, I'm no longer an atheist. I believe there's a God. I said, good. I thought that it looked like that. He said, but what do I do with Jesus? And I said, you don't expect me to answer that question, do you? This is far too much fun to watch. I'm not going to say. You know what you've got to do. Do it. The next thing was about 3 years later. He said, my live-in girlfriend and I both now believe in God, but not yet in Jesus. But we'd like to get married. Can you find a priest that will marry us? I said, I can do that. So I did. The only other person who went to church, apart from the priest and Birgitta and John, was somebody he hoiked off the street to be the witness. And he was married. And last year I have him occasionally teach a special lecture at a summer program I run in Ottawa. And this last summer I said, how do I introduce you this year, John? And he smiled. He said, the time has come. You must say that I'm a quiet Christian. 25 years. But that won't reverse. It's real. And you can see it in his writing. He writes in the National Post. And he's always making very clever jabs at the liberal elite. Well worth reading. National Post in England. These are the people you want around you, people who've worked their way through the process. So once that reductionism is in place, it's very hard to shift it because it works. In church, it's easier to have a formula, isn't it, for joining the church than to have to try and work out whether they really do know Jesus. And even when we choose people to run the church, we don't obey Paul in 1 Timothy 3. All the characteristics for leadership in the church are precisely that character. You hire skill. You appoint character. They can be illiterate. I know Africans who I would trust to run a church, but they couldn't do any of the skills that are needed, but they can hire those. You don't look for a banker or an accountant to run the money. You look for somebody whose heart is in the right place and knows what charity is. How much better the church would be if we'd obeyed Paul, that leadership in the church requires a good character. And you can't lead if you don't have it. You can still be a Christian, you can be forgiven, but you can't lead. A lot of our problems would have evaporated if we had done that. What that leads to next, of course, is that when Laplace said to Napoleon, I don't need God, he had defined the knowledge, inductively derived knowledge, which was quantitative, and it had replaced the old qualitative world. The world before the Endarkenment, I refuse to call it an enlightenment, it wasn't. The world before the Endarkenment was a qualitative world. But the qualities cannot be measured. The problem with our soft sciences is they suffer from physics envy, and it's a disaster. They try to measure what cannot be measured. The best part about a good doctor cannot be measured, so it has no metrics, and so they don't get paid for it. This is true of so many things. You can't measure parenting. Your wonderfully professionally trained childcare person, would they lose a night's sleep if they didn't see your child again? No, they would not, but you would. That's the difference. You can't measure it, but it's real. I was sucked in to the quantitative world. It provided a career. And I had a life that was not integrated. I learned to be tolerant until I realized that tolerance was not quite what it was cracked up to be. And one of the turning points in my life, I needed a whole bunch of these things to happen at once before the college started, was my most hated faculty is the Faculty of Education. I'd like to put a bomb under it. I'd remove the people first. They pretend that teaching is a skill. It's not. It's a gift. In fact, it requires two loves. You must love the subject and love the pupil. If you do that, they will listen to you for hours because we like to see love in action. And that's what it should be. That world has got to change. And this faculty sent a missive around our university saying that teaching in a state-funded institution should be from a morally neutral position. Sounds so Obama-like, doesn't it? Or Hillary-like. And it is. But of course it's rubbish. Because there is no morally neutral position to stand. You only have to ask them one question. Why should I be morally neutral? They can only answer it by proposing a debased morality. My morality is richer than that. I'm not going to take a debased version when I have a rich one. And I wrote a little paper called The Myth of Moral Neutrality that afternoon so that I would feel better. It was only about 12 pages, and it was done in 3 hours. I've never written one quicker because steam was rising and I was basically abreacting. And when I'd finished, I sent it to a friend to read who publishes a little journal for Christian doctors in Canada, and he published it without my permission. And I upbraided him for doing that. He said, it had passion, the guys will like it. And I said, it doesn't matter. I know that the average stuff I write in the mainline literature is read by 6 people, including the referees. It's not about knowledge, it's about careers. They don't read your CV, they weigh it. That's the way it works. So, but that little paper went around the world. And somewhere I was asked to record it. And somehow it got to Tennessee, to the head of the Christian Medical Dental Association, who'd just come back from N years as a missionary and realized that medicine in America, this is around the early 90s, was heading towards troubled waters, very troubled waters. And he didn't know what to do. And he called me. When I got used to the accent, he said, I've just listened to you 6 times. I said, I don't think so, I don't record. He said, you've recorded this, but it's an amateur recording. Will you come and do it properly, please? I said, I don't have the travel funds. He said, we'll look after that, and they have done ever since. My wife stayed down in Africa in '94 for 2 years, running refugee camps from the Rwanda war. We saw each other once every 6 months. But during that time, my life went from being an ivory tower professor to an entirely different life. By the time she came back, I was giving 100 lectures a year, and within 2 years, it was up to 400, and going halfway around the world every year, all because of that little paper. And the college grew out of it as well. We realized that the students who came to university and lost their faith because the real truth on which their lives should be grounded was denied standing in the university for no good reason, only by denial of history. And Protestants, having no history, they act as though nothing happened between the end of the Acts of the Apostles and the 17th century, or if you're a Pentecostal, the 19th, 20th century. That's nonsense. So initially we didn't know what to do. We read for 5 years before we started. Everything we could find on the nature of education, from the Greeks to Alistair MacIntyre. And God had put a very unusual group of people together. We didn't know one another till we were brought together by providence. David Jeffrey, who was the leader of the group, really, now at Baylor, retired emeritus professor, I think the best evangelical intellect on the continent, speaks 9 languages, had to choose between doing a PhD in physics or medieval English at Princeton, and chose medieval English. Is a professor in the University of Beijing, where he teaches the Bible in English literature every year at the behest of the communist government. Amazingly. We had Graham Hunter, who's a very good philosopher, just written a superb book on Pascal. We had a man called Ernest Caparros, who was John Paul II's canon lawyer. Edith Humphrey, a Tom Wright-trained theologian, who's now at Pittsburgh, teaching the Presbyterians how to talk about sexuality, amongst other things. I was the only idiot in the group. Everybody else spoke at least 5 languages. But we realized that what we wanted to do was utterly unacceptable to the feminists in particular. We would never get it into the university, and we started in a church basement 20 years ago. We didn't actually want to do it. It was homeschooling moms and dads who wanted us to do it, and graduate students. We knew that they needed to be taught their history. So we teach the history of ideas in the areas of science and medicine and math, art and architecture, literature, philosophy, a history of faith, Latin to make you a bit more logical, a short course on the trivium to understand what education should be like, and we make sure you can answer all those issues that I've listed in the lecture. And it lasts 8 months. It is an extraordinary experience. I have never enjoyed teaching like this in the university, ever. This is an entirely different order of things. People's lives are transforming before your eyes. You know, you can see the change. Parents are routinely in tears at graduation. They cannot believe what we can do in 8 months. I don't even give a mark to anyone in my class till the final essay, because the last 2 months they start to integrate it all. They're on almost vertical takeoff. They write stuff at the end which is publishable. And certainly, although we will never have formal credits, all we have to do is say, where do you want to go? What do you want to do? Which university? Let's see, who do I know there? If I don't know anybody, I'll find somebody who does. And then you send your best essay beyond the bureaucratic barrier. The bureaucrats are the problem. We don't know how to control them. The only way I've found to control bureaucrats is whenever they ask for information, I write back and say, why do you need this information? And then when they tell me, I send them qualitative information so they can't make metrics out of it. That's what they need. We've got to change it. They will destroy us. They destroyed Byzantium, they'll destroy us. When they were, as they used to be, good Christian people trying to serve, they called themselves civil servants. Now they're just protecting their own careers. That's a problem. So in teaching that course, it is amazing to watch the Christian mind being rebuilt before your very eyes. And I know in the next few weeks I will get a few emails from parents. One of my favourite ones was a few years ago now. It was from a doctor. He said, I've just done a 3-hour journey with my son. He was chattering away the whole time about things I'd never heard of. Keep up the good work. We have a rich history. And we need to know it. We need to know who our heroes were. What do these people all have in common? Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Boyle, Faraday, Clerk Maxwell, Eddington, just to take one stream of physics. What do all those characters have in common? You know, don't you? Say it. They're all believers. And Kepler, Boyle, Faraday, and Clerk Maxwell would be wonderful members of your church. Faraday had no higher education whatsoever. His only education was in the church, and yet he refused to become president of the Royal Society, and he was president of the Royal Institute, and to this day they have a Christmas lecture for children called the Faraday Lecture. And yet probably none of the young people in your church know what Faraday was like. He stopped his committee meetings at the Royal Institute so that he didn't miss his prayer meeting. He had his priorities right. Now, questions is what it's really about, because I have talked too much, as usual, I'm sure. I can't see the time from here, but it's probably longer than it should be. And I know that there will be some questions. And certainly for the next 4 days, interrupt anything I'm saying if you need something elucidated, because you might forget later. And if you don't understand it, there's probably other people who don't understand it too, and I haven't communicated as well as I did. I couldn't get my wife to come this time because we're too busy in the next few weeks, and there's a lot of ducks to get in a row before I get home. But if she was here, she would probably have interrupted at least 3 times by now to say, do that again, you can do it better than that. So interrupt. But any questions? Yes, only my typical day though. But the students, there are 6 of us giving lectures every week. And they last, sorry? You have to say that louder because I'm deaf.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yes, of course. What does a typical day at Augustine look like? Well, there's a lecture in philosophy, there's a lecture in art, there's a science lecture, there's a history of the church, a history of faith lecture. There's a series of shorter lectures on Latin. They learn Latin in 8 months. It's amazing, quite functionally. There's a community meal every week where we all eat together once, if we can. I make it about 30% of the time. That's the usual rate for professors, except Edward Tingley and Doug Heyman, who are always there pretty well. And we have sundry other activities going on as well. Otherwise than that, it's talking to one another and writing a lot. They write probably 30 things by the time they've finished it. And the last thing they do is going to be 6 essays of about a dozen pages each. So that's, the kind of work that you do at a master's level in many cases. But they get to that level, they do it. every now and again somebody tries to earn a little money at the same time, and that wrecks them. It's a full-time job. Typically, at the end of the first week, they will get together, and as one of them said, we all got together and we said, we're in trouble. Only if we work together are we going to get through this. And of course they always do. We don't stretch our young people. We don't challenge them enough. And when you do, they rise to every time. Some of them, and I'm delighted when this happens, they will say to me something like, you've given me a reading list that will last me the rest of my life. I don't think I'm going to give my money to the university. I'm going to go to the community college to learn some skills that I need to make the things that I want to make, and I want to make them well. That's perfect. Nobody will computerize electricians, plumbers, and the like, you know. They're safe. You go into most other areas as a Christian now, you've got to be very good because they're out to get you. You've got to be very subtle too. So we want our people to get to where they go without effort, because if God has made you to do something, one of the ways you can check that is to keep the Sabbath quite strictly, not in a legalistic fashion, but use the Sabbath for what it's meant to be, a day of total removal from the concerns of the week as far as that is possible. Don't do any work. You can do things that other people might call work. What I do for relaxation, other people would call work, but that's just me. My mother, brilliant woman that she was, said, you can do on Sunday anything that you can take Jesus with you to do. For a child, that's perfect. And if the child is at the stage where Jesus would play baseball, that's fine. Let them do that. But keeping the Sabbath, as Jeremiah 17 puts it, if you will keep my Sabbath, then princes will enter Jerusalem. It's a day for practicing what you're going to be, a prince or a princess if you're sexist. You know, that's our future life, so to speak. And of course, you've never seen the Queen carrying a burden, have you? Somebody else carries all the burdens. We've got no burdens to carry on that day. Now, if you can't get through school taking that day off a week, you're in the wrong place. You're trying to do something which your dutifulness will get you through, but you'll be stretched beyond your limits for the rest of your life. That's not the way it should be. If you're made for it, it doesn't work that way. I never took work home as a professor. My son doesn't take work home because we're made to do this. I once what's the word with absolutely no justification is the only way I can put it, I got an award for teaching in the university. It was another of the turning points because a Chinese professor in our department said to me, how much time do you actually spend preparing undergraduate lectures? And I flippantly said, well, 20 minutes is a bit excessive, isn't it? And he said, you're not joking, are you? I said, no, I'm not actually. And he said, it's so unfair. I spend hours on my lectures, and the students always complain. But he wasn't providing anything that they couldn't get from a textbook. There's no point in reading a textbook to someone. If you can't bring something to life in a way that excites them, what's the point? So God has made people for jobs. And if he's made you for the job, it's a pleasure, a privilege to do it. Do what you do heartily as unto the Lord. He loves humble people most. People like me are a pain to other people, you know. That's the way we are. When people tell me, you intimidate us, and I say, I don't mean to, but you do. I have to accept that. But that's my job, to intimidate you a little bit. But this project is doable. And if you did, you would be putting into this community in the area approximately a dozen students every year who would keep in touch with one another and who had well-formed Christian minds, who know what right and wrong are and how to argue for it. They can change a culture. Starting at a local level would be easy. We've already had people come to our course and the summer program we run, and there's half a dozen medical schools that now have one of our people in their education area of medical school. It changes the school. Because if you have somebody who really understands why they want to do something and can give reasons for it, in the long run you can win. But we haven't been training our students well enough. We've got to behave like the Jews. The Jews have learned to live as a minority. And you live as a minority, the first thing that we need to do like the Jews is that if you're a smart guy in a synagogue, you do not have to pay for your education. The synagogue will do that. But they will make sure that you go into an area where you can represent the Jewish community. And look what they've done. That's what we've got to do. We founded Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, Chicago. They were all evangelical foundations, and we gave them all away because of intellectual laziness. We wouldn't do the work. Now we have young people who could do the work, and we need to get them back into those positions. We need to take back what is ours. We'll probably have to rebuild it while it rots. But this is a cheap project, very low cost. Just got to pray the people into the jobs and find enough of them to live on. So the day is hard work all the way through, but much enjoyed. Lots of fun too, I mean. But it is hard work. If you can't write grammatically, don't come. We don't care about the content because we can fix that. We do like to have at least some half-decent grammar to start with. Because grammar is, to write well, is to think well. To write badly is to think badly. Laziness. Having reprimanded you on that one, what's next? Yes?
What would you do if somebody really tried to make it through the program but had real struggles, and you saw that they were not going to get through? How would you...
You mean if they vilify what we do?
They're in the midst of the program and they find that they can't keep...
Oh, they come and talk to us and say, well, look, audit the bits that you can't handle and do the other bits. But you know that we won't give you a diploma because that would suggest that we think you should go on in this direction, and you clearly shouldn't. But that doesn't mean this is a waste of time. It isn't. They're the ones who go on and do what God made them for. They find out what God made them for. The fact that there's a 10% probability that you will find your spouse while you're there, that's a good thing. And I teach them, and I did it here at VT a long while ago. I always say, when God brings a spouse into your life, marry them and start reproducing. Because that's the purpose of marriage. And that's what makes us better people. We are born to serve the needs of the young, aren't we? It's not pure continuous joy. Nobody can pretend that 3-year-olds are pure continuous joy, but if you're allowed to produce a half-decent outcome, what they bring into your life is beyond words. We had our 50th wedding anniversary last summer. I didn't want one, I hate those things, but the children said, you have to. And so it had to be at the farm, we live on a farm now, and it had to be in the middle of the day because of all the grandchildren. It was a lunchtime celebration that went on until it was time for the children to go to bed. Later, when I looked at the photographs, I don't turn to tears very easily, but I realized this is amazing. There were my 22 grandchildren, and there were 2 others, my brother-in-law's 2 grandchildren were there. So those 24 children who were there, not one of them had ever for a moment considered the possibility of divorce. Can you imagine getting over 50 people together with no divorce in North America today? That's the way it should be. And when you've completed a course like this, you'll realize it can be like that. It's not that we don't know how to do it, we do. Train your minds. It doesn't say in Romans 12 to be transformed by the renewal of your feelings, does it? But that's what most people go to church for, to feel better. Listen to those verbs. If you have an Augustine college in this community, you will start hearing think after the morning service rather than feel. What do you think about that? Not how do you feel this morning? Your feelings have no permanent significance, you know. And they're not your province, they're God's. You can't do anything about your feelings. They come from you know not where, and they go you know not where. And God can change those feelings at will when he wishes. The longest period of my life in which I had a subjective sense of Christ was for 2 months in 1995. And I was in the most unhappy place on earth at the time, right in the middle of the refugee camps from the Rwanda war, teaching for between 3 and 6 hours a day, every other day for 2 months. I was in tears, they were in tears, and I was the happiest man in the world. Because that was the first time in my life that I gave the gift that God had given me back to him to use, and he did. I denied for many years that he'd made me articulate, which I know is an insult to the giver. But after that, I did Christian things, as you probably do. But how often have you done Christian things cold, so to speak, where God asks you to do something, not you ask God whether he'll bless what you want to do, which is the normal way we do it. Well, that summer, my research project in the area was destroyed by the war and all the chaos that was around it. And I arrived and my wife said, "Oh, by the way, I've arranged for you to meet the leaders of my camps tomorrow morning." She knows I don't suffer from jet lag. I said, "You've done what?" She said, "You heard." I said, "What am I going to say to them? They've lost everything. What experience of that do I have?" She said, "They need you. You will be fine. They want to talk to you. They won't talk to the people from the peace and reconciliation programs because they talk rubbish, but they know you don't." We talked for 3 hours, and then we got to the question, can you help us understand why we who call ourselves Christian, 80% of Rwandans go to church, how we who call ourselves Christian had killed people who sat next to us in church because they belonged to the other tribe. They were remorseful. They were repentant. It wasn't planned. It was an outpouring of evil. Unfortunately, God had prepared me. And so I ended up, once you give him an inch, he takes a yard. But that's good. I've been in Africa many times. I know that when you say you'll give a lecture, you say, "I'll give one lecture." I didn't. I said, "There are 4 lectures which might help you." And they said, "Can we arrange them?" And I knew what they were going to do. And I said, yes. So those 4 talks had to be done in many different locations. And they took about between 3 and 6 hours to get through the talk and what followed from it. But I felt his pleasure. Quite intoxicating. You don't learn that till you take risks. If you wish to run your own life, as the Spanish put it, God says to us, take what you want and pay the price attached. Take nothing and he'll pay. And it's much better. So if you take some risks to do this, don't worry about it. It's his project. Put it in his hands. Trust him. Yeah.
So you may address this tomorrow morning. I can't really tell from the title of your talk, but I have 6 children, and my oldest is 11. So if you're talking about in this program, you're teaching them Latin in the course of 8 months and a vast history of Christian history. Am I wasting my time doing that right now?
No, you're not wasting your time. Home and Christian schooling is very good. It's much harder than you thought it would be, though, right? And you're probably learning more than they are. But they're learning much more than you think. So, no, that's not true at all. There are always holes in the education of homeschooled, but there are holes in a real structure, whereas the others come with holes and no structure. It's a different world altogether. So, no, don't give up at all. You may feel, that so much more could be done, and the answer is always yes, that's true. On my website, which has just been redone, there are about, there's lots of talks anyway, all for free. And the one you need for your husband is called "Why Are There No Hittites on the Streets of New York?" Any homeschooling mom needs to get her husband to play that role. And the Jews, I won't say any more. The title intrigues people, so they have to go and listen to it. And amazingly, in Africa, every time I go, I have to give that talk at least a dozen times. And I say to people asking me to do that talk, I said, I've done it here before. They say, we know that, but we want to bring our friends to hear it. Because if I had a development project for Africa, it would in fact be to put a good commentary on Deuteronomy into the hands of every African pastor. That's the book they need. Because Deuteronomy is God's commencement address for a flourishing nation. That's what it is. So if you ever have to do a commencement address, plagiarize Moses. It's brilliant. Particularly chapters 4, 5, and 6, which is what that talk is about. The heart of Jewish life is the home, and the father's teaching at the dining room table is the central educational project of a Jewish family. And that is to transmit the stories of the Old Testament to the children before the age of 7, thereby teaching them moral consequence and giving them a moral reference bank. You can't do more than that. Does that help?
Yes, you said also to write well is to think well, so obviously...
I can't hear, I'm afraid. I'm growing old, curmudgeonly, and deaf.
You said to write well is to think well, so I'm spending time teaching them to write, and grammar is important.
Yes.
Are there other bullet points that you would say spend your time in these early years focusing?
Well, reading good stuff. The aim is to get them past Enid Blyton, so to speak. Once they get to better literature, that's it. There was a lovely article by Roger Scruton in First Things in the last year or two called Living with a Mind, which describes, he also was educated, but it's very like my story, but he writes beautifully. And to get them to appreciate good writing, once they start doing that, the other thing you can do a little later than your homeschooling, the best thing I ever did for my children in this respect, we used to have a rule in our family that presents should not cost more than $10. When you've got 6, that's still a lot of money. But you have to be creative to do something good for $10. And the best solution I ever came up with, which I could only do once per child, but I would buy them a little notebook, blank pages, nice one, nicely bound. And then I filled the first 20 pages with my favorite quotations with them in mind. They all got the habit. The most academic one in the family, my son, by the time he went to university, he'd filled 2 books. And like his father, he didn't know what he wanted to do. I only went to medical school because another student at school said, "Where do you have to go? And you need to get away from home." And so I went to London. He was the same. I said to him, I never asked my children what their marks were when they were in high school. I wasn't interested in their marks because I didn't trust the teachers. I asked them what they'd learned every day and corrected what was wrong. And I said, "What do you want to do? What have you?" He said, "I haven't done anything." I said, "Well, what subjects do you like?" He said, "I like them all." I said, "Well, are your marks obscenely good?" And he said, "Some people would say so." I said, "Well, the Combined Arts and Science program at Mac will keep your options open for another year. See if I can make that happen, because you're late." Well, he got in. Now, it's lovely what happens to Christian kids when they go away, if they've been brought up reasonably well. And he went to university the year his mother stayed on in Africa. He was there with us. At one point, we were all held up by guns at gunpoint. We didn't know why, and nothing happened to us. Another guy appeared out of the darkness at 1 a.m, and we were free. And the one thing we noticed is that we didn't require any courage for none of the 3 of us, his mum, me, and him. We weren't frightened. And in fact, after 5 minutes, the guy holding us at gunpoint, I said to him, "Are you frightened?" And he said, "No." I said, "Neither am I, neither is your mother." And he knows that, and it's really bothering him. Because they have a sense of the strength of someone's spirit, and they fear taking the life of someone with a spirit stronger than theirs. That's what kept us alive. But we weren't afraid. What Sally and I didn't know is that for 6 months at a time, we had no communication. And she was in the middle of a war zone. There was no email to Central Africa at that point. But she wasn't afraid, neither was I. One occasion she called me and I said, "Where are you?" And she said, "Oh, Kigali." I said, "But the war's going on between you and there." And she said, "Yeah, but it's quiet. I went through. It was all right." The missionaries wanted to give her a T-shirt, "No fear," which is true. I say she's not courageous. Courage is overcoming fear. She has no fear, so she's not courageous. No, that's the way it is. But this guy had a wonderful Jewish teacher for Western Civ. And she's a liberal, and she said, "I like you to use BCE, but I acknowledge something happened." And at the end of the year, she gave him an A+ for the course and said, "Jonathan, I will miss your essays next year because you always seem to have bigger questions on your mind than I do." And he said it was easy. Every topic she set, I had a quotation in my books that I already knew by heart by a great scholar, which basically laid out what I needed to say. So get your children to appreciate things that are said well. Teach them. If you hear something said well, the only excuse you have for saying it badly is laziness. Write it down and learn it. Do you know which book of the Bible quotes other bits of the Bible most? Which book in the Bible has the most references to other books? Well, it's Revelation. And what's interesting about them, well, at least this is what Peterson told me, is that they're almost all paraphrases. They are not word-perfect takes. You have to know the source well to realize that's where that came from. And he does it over 200 times. That's what you need to get to, where your style shows where you've come from. People recognize who had an influence on me when I'm talking. If they were in Westminster Chapel, where Martin Lloyd-Jones preached, they can hear some of his phrases and his tones and the way he would do it. I've had people come up and tap me on the shoulder and say, "Just like being back in the chapel." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Oh, you can hear the old man." And it's true. That's good. That's the best form of, well, I don't know what the word is for it, but it's good to pass that on. And if you can get your children to love anything deeply, you're halfway to real learning. So loving things said beautifully is a wonderful addiction to have. My favorite line in poetry is from Gerard Manley Hopkins. "Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in eyes and lovely in limbs, not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces." Isn't that beautiful? I love the thought of Christ playing. And when I watch my grandchildren, it's when I remember that bit of poetry. Because Christ plays in children, doesn't he? At their best. Hopkins can capture it. Yeah. Well, it's late and you've probably got babysitters and things. I'm not in a hurry, so if you want to ask questions and we're just too shy to ask, good, in public, yeah. And if you make a really crass mistake, that's 100% learning experience, so risk it.
What would you say is the ideal time to attend college?
The ideal time is when God sends you. And I mean that very seriously. The people who get the most of it, out of it, come later. But that's a very risky thing to do. And you might only get one opportunity. Life gets very busy. Treat it as a gap year. That's the way to think about it. But we've had doctors take a break and come and take the course. We've had at least half a dozen medical students who took a year off their course to take it. We've had, every year, there's 2 or 3 students out of the average has been 13 to 15. 2 or 3 of those have got 1 degree before. And that's lovely because they're Christian and so they're kind to the young ones. They say, look, you have no idea how rich this is. You're not going to meet anything like this again, so make the most of it. And that's very useful to have it from them. So we have all sorts of interesting ones. We had a paramedic who got married and brought his wife. They got married and they paid off their bills, and they weren't in debt. And he said, look, I would like us, as the first thing we do after we're married, is to go and do this course. Now his wife had to look after the family because I think mom had died, something like that. So she'd never been to beyond high school. And she said, I'll come with you, but this is going to be out of my league. She turned out to be the best student in the year. She took off. She wrote beautifully. It was so lovely to watch. And the two of them were, parents to the others in many ways. But any educational system would have said, well, you're not ready for this. But no. I simply asked, do you really want to do it? And can you write? And she could write. And I said, we can do the rest. And she turned out to be the best student. That's what should happen in school. When I started changing my teaching habits, the first time I gave my 8-hour exam, I gave an A+ to a girl who'd never had anything above a B+. So my mark stood out like a sore thumb. But my mark just took her average to the point where she could get into graduate school. The reason I gave her the mark is she could think. She's now an individually funded researcher with about $1 million a year coming in. If she hadn't taken my course, that would never have happened. You can thumb your nose at the education system. It's got negative talent. It gets most things wrong. Yes. Is that a hand up or just stretching? Yeah. You can stretch properly. Yeah. Does that make sense? It's not difficult to learn things you love. I mean, you won't learn Latin as well as younger people, but that doesn't matter. You don't have to do Latin. You'll learn a bit about the language, but that's helpful. You'll see how it's affected our language. I mean, the guy who preceded Tolkien in his professorship at Oxford in philology had no formal education. Oxford was a good school in those days. He was actually a coal miner in Yorkshire, as a guy about your age. And then he noticed that one guy in the village was making more money teaching the other guys to read and write than he was making down the pit. He said, well, I can do that. And shortly he'd made enough money. He started wandering around Europe. And he went to universities and he'd find out who was doing interesting lectures, and he learned. And he went there and learned the language, went on to the next one. So when he came back to Oxford after wandering all over Europe, and he saw, oh, there's a job at Oxford in philology. Well, he knew more languages than anyone else who had applied, and they gave him the job. They were a good university in those days. They didn't look at bits of paper. They said, wow, he's good. And that still happens to a degree. Even here. When I came here, nobody ever looked at any of my... I could be a complete fraud. They never checked. Well, they knew what I'd published, and since quite a lot of it was single author, I suppose they got some justification. But I've got a friend at Georgetown who's head of nephrology. He'd never done dialysis except on dogs when they gave him the job. It didn't matter. So that joy, joie de vivre, is what I would like to see happening, and it happens, As students go to school and they start making trouble in a very nice way, like asking questions that professors don't want to be asked and getting together to sort it out. That same guy who I told you about, who stopped the professor, in that it's a very feminist school, so one of the things the guys have to do is they have to give a joint presentation with a girl to show that they can work across the gender barrier. Anyway, a Muslim girl came up to Nathan and said, will you do your joint presentation with me? And he said, sure. What do you want it on? She said, I'd like us to do it on some aspect of sexuality. He said, yeah, I'll do that. And he gave her a paper I'd introduced him to. The first economic analysis of the effect of the contraceptive pill shows that the net effect economically has been to transfer money from women and children to men. Not exactly a conclusion that will be welcomed in a place like McMaster. So they worked on it. And of course, with all the students doing this, on the day of the presentation, lots of profs were working, and you just went to find out who you were going to present to. And of course, they got the guy that Nathan had made fun of or made a fool of on day one. And he said to the girl, "Look who we've got. We're not going to get a good mark." And bless her, she said, "I've enjoyed this. I don't care if we don't get a good mark. It's been very good for me." Well, he was a good guy. He gave them maximum marks. He said, "You deserve it for courage alone, but you also did an excellent presentation." So the modern students, they want to see some passion in the people that are teaching. And it's got to be real. I mean, I hope it's apparent that I love doing what I do. You know, I'm the wrong side of 75, but I try not to believe it, you know. Hopefully it'll remain that way for a long while. Yeah. So, I mean, there's not enough joy in learning, is there? And I've got a daughter with 9 children, and she's doing homeschooling as well. And they love coming to our farm. And walking with them, they come to life, and they have better eyes than I have. You know, I showed my youngest grandson a tree frog. I found 1 in 10 years. He found 4 that afternoon, you know. That's what children do. And they begin to see other children. They say it's boring, and they can't see anything. City people don't know how to look, you know. Their eyes have not been trained. But Luke will just dive into the grass, and out he'll come with a frog. You know, that's what he's like. And he's going to be good. They love learning, and they love playing word games and that sort of thing. That's the way it should be. If you don't tell children something they're doing is supposed to be difficult, they don't know, do they? They just do it. My friend David Jeffrey homeschooled his kids. And just to encourage you. I mean, David does speak 9 languages, but in Ontario we have an inspector for homeschoolers, because some people homeschool because they're too lazy to get up in the morning. They're not actually doing homeschooling, they're just producing useless offspring. And they have to be pulled into some sort of line. And these inspectors have the right to enter your home, of course. So the guy knocked on his door and showed him the card and said, "I'm the inspector of schools, I've come to see what your children are doing." He said, "Have a coffee." He said, "No, I want to see what you're doing." They said, "Fine. Let's go and see what they're doing." Well, one was 11, the other was 7, something like that. One was translating Greek, the other was doing calculus. The way he got to calculus, one day when he was much younger, he'd come home and he said to his dad, "What would happen if we substituted letters for numbers?" And David, being smart, said, "Well, let's try and see what happens." And of course he was doing algebra in no time, and so it went on. He sat down, the guy, when he said, "I don't need to be here, I'll be on my way." "No, David, have a coffee, I'd like to hear what you do." And he said, "Well, most homeschoolers are ready for university at the age of about 13 in terms of intellectual development. There are people going to university who are no more developed than they are. They're not socially developed to the degree to be able to handle university. But it's just the lazy ones we have to find. But the rest, they're much better. So be encouraged. And if you have a follow-up of an Augustine college here, that will get them ready for university. Yes? No, we would accept 20. That would be a good number for us economically, but God has given us on average 13.
How many apply? Do you accept everyone who applies?
You have to apply. We won't take you in cold, so to speak. We want to see that you can write something. We don't take everyone. They've got to have show that they've got certain aptitude. It's not a remedial training program, in other words. What it is a program to prepare bright kids to resist unjustified attacks from malicious professors. And there are plenty of them around. And hopefully, in many cases, to put them off taking a liberal arts degree at the moment. Why would you want your children to be taught by somebody who believes neither in truth nor in God? How they take a salary, I don't know. Well, of course, they have no morals either. But they're clever. You can't choose universities anymore. You have to choose teachers. And if necessary, pick up your training by simply going to the professors you want to go to slowly. You can do that because you have a network. As a Christian, you are much more connected than you realize. When I first read that thing about everybody being connected by 7 handshakes, I said, no, it's not true. And so I thought about it. I said, well, let's try the Pope and George Bush. It was the time when George Bush was president. And I was amazed. Within a day, it was 2 handshakes to the Pope, and within a week, it was 1 handshake to George Bush. Because it turned out that one of my friends, a Texas gynecologist, went to school with George Bush, so that was 1 to him. Another of my friends, a lawyer, knew Richard John Newhouse, who was the first editor of First Things, who was also from the Ottawa Valley, where I come from now. And every time he went to Rome, he had dinner with the Pope, because the Pope loved First Things. That was John Paul. So it was 2 to the Pope and 1 to George. So that means you're only 2 more away at the most, because Ty is 1 away from me, and you're 1 away from Ty. It's amazing how connected we are. And we need to use it a lot more. When you go on holiday, you really ought to be visiting with Christians, because it's good. It's fellowship. It will make the holiday better. And the connectedness blows the world's mind. One of the women who pushed me into doing what I do now is a palliative care physician, an American actually, but she's lived in Vancouver all her life as a doctor. And I was there not long ago, and I said, Margaret, thanks to you, I think I can get a bed in any city in America in 20 minutes. She said, you could get a bed in any town in America in 20 minutes, because you are that well known. And she said, and I have, as you know, a network. She said, just recently, a friend of mine was talking to her neighbor somewhere in the States, and her neighbor said, I took my son to Emerge today. He had a blotch on his thigh, and I didn't like the look of it, but the young doctor there poked it around and said, well, it's not an abscess, but it looks a bit odd. Come back again tomorrow. But I'm worried about it. I don't know what to do. And she said, a friend said, well, you could call my friend Margaret. So she gave her Margaret's number, and she called, and Margaret said, which town are you in now? Let me think about it. And then she said, yes, I know an ID physician there. And she gave him the number. Called him and said that Margaret said, you should probably see him. And he called her back. She called him, and he called the patient and said, you better bring your son back and bring his pajamas, he might be coming in. He was in the OR in 90 minutes. He had flesh-eating disease. He was out of hospital in a week with no serious damage. And as she was leaving hospital, this woman said to the ID physician, who do I thank? And he laughed and said, you better thank Jesus, because there's no other way your son would have got into the OR in 90 minutes. That's how connected we are. And we need to we're going to have to live it, because the limiting factor for your generation is who you can trust. And what are your grounds of trust justified? The church, you can't trust everyone. I usually say dull Presbyterians are the most worthy to be trusted. A third generation Presbyterian is pretty reliable. Pentecostal, not in the same league. So, make sense? Thank you.